is a giant Napoleon, and here are some little Napoleons. Kirsch-flavored pastry cream sandwiched in between flaky, buttery layers of puff pastry, topped with white fondant icing and decorated with chocolate. We're doing French puff pastry and Napoleons next time on The French Chef. This is a giant Napoleon, and I'm cutting it up into little Napoleons because we're doing Napoleons today on The French Chef.
The French Chef is made possible by a grant from Hills Brothers Coffee Incorporated and a grant from the Polaroid Corporation.
Now this is a Napoleon. This is what it looks like. And what it is are layers of lovely buttery flaky pastry sandwiched in between layers of pastry cream and decorated with a white frosting and with chocolate. And there are good Napoleons and bad Napoleons. And I think the goodness of the Napoleon really depends on the deliciousness of the flaky pastry with which it's made. And the flaky pastry, we have found in our experiments, depends very much on the flour with which you make it. Because what flaky pastry is French puff pastry or pâte feuilletée with layers of dough and layers of butter. And my colleague Simon Beck and I made a lot of, we just spent years trying to make French puff pastry using American all-purpose flour. And we found we were just never satisfied with it because it was terribly difficult to roll out, and it never had the lovely flaky texture and the tenderness that puff pastry made with French flour had. And puff pastry is very easy to make with French flour just because it's easy to roll. So Simca and I finally made the equivalent of French flour by mixing pastry flour with all-purpose flour, and we found that the perfect equivalent of flour was 2/3 pastry flour and 1/3 all-purpose flour, and you just mix it all together in a container. And we also found that unbleached flour gave a more tender texture than bleached flour. And unfortunately, pastry flour is not always easy to find, and I'm going to tell you about that when we get to mixing the dough, because puff pastry is paper-thin layers of dough and paper-thin layers of butter, and they're rolled in a very special way so that you end up with 730 layers of butter between layers of dough. So I'm going to start right in on the dough. And for this, we want 4 cups of either this special pastry and all-purpose mix, or you can use granular flour. And whichever you use, you measure it exactly the same way. You put a 1 cup dry measure into your container and then just level it off even with the lip of the cup, and that's the way to measure the flour. And you want 4 cups. I already have 3 cups in here. And then you want 3/4 of a stick of chilled butter, and that's just about 3 ounces. And this you cut up into small pieces, and then you're going to mix it in with the flour. This starts out exactly as though you were making a regular pie crust dough. And just by cutting it into small pieces, it starts it out more easily. And then you can either rub the flour and the dough between the tips of your fingers, which you can do very rapidly. You see, you're just taking a piece of butter and then just squeezing it between your fingers. Or you can use the pastry blender, which is here, a piece of wood and a lot of wires, and you just chop it up and down, because what you're trying to do is to break the dough break the butter up into the flour. And now, about where to buy pastry flour. Pastry flour is soft wheat flour, and it is used for making pie crusts and puff pastry. It's not cake flour, so don't mix it up with cake flour. Cake flour comes in a box, and pastry flour comes in a bag. And it's, if you can't find it in a regular store, you might try a health food store and look for organic soft wheat flour. And the reason that it's so hard to find is that nobody asks for it. Where I live, you can get it, and luckily there's some of it made, but if there were more demand, you'd be able to buy pastry flour more easily. And now, after you have your butter and flour mixed so that the butter looks like a coarse meal, you're then ready to add the water. And you want 1 cup of cold water, and if it's a warm day, use ice water. And then 2 tablespoons of salt in the 1 cup of water. I always like to mix the salt in first because then it all dissolves. And then this goes into your butter and flour mixture. And then blend it around with a rubber spatula. And then with your hands. Now that was 4 cups of flour, 3/4 of a cup, 3/4 of a stick of butter, 2 teaspoons of salt, and 1 cup of water. Then after you've blended the water in, you then knead your dough into a ball, and the dough should be fairly firm, because you don't want to have too much water in it. And then you have to let the dough rest. And so wrap it in wax paper and a damp towel. And the reason that you want it to rest is so that the butter will harden up a little bit, and so also the dough, because you worked it around a bit, will relax. And then just a slightly damp towel, and this should relax for about 40 minutes. And chill, and then you're ready to start forming your dough. This initial dough is called a détente. And you'll find that if you chill it first, it makes it very much easier to do. And then you want 3 sticks, or 3/4 of a pound of chilled butter, and that you beat up, because you want it to be cold but malleable. And this is an extremely important part of this, and you'll see why. And after you've beaten it to soften it a little bit, push it out with the heel of your hand, because ideally you want the butter and your dough détrempe to be just about exactly the same consistency. But do not neglect this part of kneading the butter. And then form it into a 5-inch square and set it aside, and then take your détente and roll that out to about a 9-inch circle. Then the butter is going to go in the center of that. And then take your butter square and put it right in the center of the circle, and then bring the dough up around it. It makes no difference if this initial détente is rather rough. The point is that you want to really work it in the beginning as little as possible, because it's going to get lots of work as you roll it out. You see, I'm bringing the edges of the dough all around and making a nice little package here. And be sure when you bring the edges around, you don't make the sides thinner. The sides should stay just as thick as the bottom, so don't pull them around, because you have plenty of dough on the top that you can bring around. And then you're going to start rolling. You see, all this is now is just your butter and your dough. Now you want to flour it slightly, and you're going to start rolling it out and make what is known as the first turn. And your fold is on top. Then you move your pin back and forth, little bit, and this is going to be rolled out into a rectangle about 16 inches long and 8 inches wide. And it's very important in making puff pastry that you have everything just as cold as possible. And what I do with my marble, I put it in the refrigerator before I start working, and then it is cold. But if you try and make puff pastry and on a hot day and you have a sort of a warm board, you're going to find that it's going to be very difficult. So remember, with puff pastry, keep everything cold. Now you've rolled it out into a rectangle about 16 by 8 inches, and then it's going to be folded in three as though you folded a business letter. So you take the bottom and fold it up to the middle, and try and keep this just as even as possible. And then you fold the top down to meet. See, this is the way it looks. You have your 3 layers there. There's your bottom layer, and then this is folded over, and then you have your top. And this actually, you see, you have your butter in between each one of these 3 layers. And this is called, now this first rolling out and folding is called a turn. And you make your turns in pairs, and you're now going to make a second rolling and folding, or turn. And I want to point out, too, if you're going to go into puff pastry, you've got to get yourself some decent rolling pins. Now this one is a pastry chef's pin that you can get at a pastry supply store. And it's a fine, heavy pin with ball bearings. And this is a French pin that's used for making croissants and puff pastries. You see it's cannellated. And if you're ever, when you're in Paris the next time, and if you go up the Rue Montmartre, which is just beyond Les Halles, or the Central Markets, and you look on the left-hand side, you'll see some wholesale pastry houses. And that's where you can get one of these pins. And they're just marvelous because they spread the butter out. And even though they make a little cannellated mark on the top of the dough, that's all right because you can smooth it out later. And now, roll it out, your dough out again to about 16 by 8. And you may find that the underside, the flaps of the underside, haven't come quite out to the end. So you can turn the dough over and roll that, and make sure that your dough isn't sticking to your surface. And I think you may find that rolling is a little bit difficult at first, but it's simply a matter of practice. And be sure when you roll that you start about an inch beyond the bottom edge and roll only to about an inch beyond the top edge, and just have an even pushing motion. This is purely a matter of practice, and by making puff pastry, you'll find that you learn how to roll very nicely, and everything's so neat, it's always fun to do. Then again, you fold it in 3. That makes a very nice little package. You can push this over a little bit. Now there's your second turn, and so to indicate how many turns you've had, you take your fingers and press them into the top of the dough, which makes little finger marks, so then you know that you have made 2 turns, because you have to make 6 turns in all. And then again, this must be wrapped up in some wax paper and a damp towel. The reason you use a slightly damp towel is so that your dough doesn't crust on the top. And if it seems a little bit damp, the dough, flour it lightly. And now you can make this puff pastry with that instant blending or granular flour, and you use exactly the same proportions. But the trouble with the all-purpose granular flour is that it is really made for bread, and it has a lot of gluten. So after you rolled it for a while, it becomes rather stiff and difficult to roll. And if you do use the granular flour, just remember to let it rest more than you would this. And now we have our 2 turns, and we want 6 turns in all. And so after your first 2 turns, you put it in the refrigerator, and you let it rest for 40 minutes. And then you unwrap it and roll it out and give it 2 more turns. That makes 4 in all. And then after your 4th turn, you can let it rest overnight. But you have to make your first 4 turns within an hour, because otherwise your butter isn't thin enough and it can lump up before you've rolled it out again. And then after your 4 turns, you make your final 2, which makes 6 turns in all. And this one now has 6 turns, and you can see these little finger marks. So this is now, you're now ready to roll out and make the Napoleons. And this recipe makes 16 Napoleons, and I'm just going to roll out half of this dough and make 8 Napoleons. And with your puff pastry, you can, the part that you aren't using, you can refrigerate or you can freeze. So I shall set this aside and then roll this out. I think it's usually a good idea after you've made your 6 turns to let it rest a little bit more, but that depends entirely on how you feel the dough is. If it's rubbery and difficult to roll, just put it in the refrigerator and let it rest and then continue. I think that is the secret. And now we're ready to put this on a pastry sheet, which I have dampened. Now it gets rolled out. It's going to roll it out to about 14 by 20 inches. And it should be about an inch larger all around than your pastry sheet. And be sure in the rolling, too, that everything is cold and that you keep flouring your board so that the dough doesn't stick to it, because if it sticks to it, you can't then roll it out properly. Doesn't make a difference really what size your plaque is, as long as you roll the dough a little bit bigger all around than it is. But ideally, you'd want a pastry sheet that was about 12 inches wide, because you cut the Napoleons into strips, as you'll see. Now, at this part, if you were using the granular or instant flour, you may find that it was very difficult to roll it out thin enough, and in that case, you just have to flour it and roll it into a piece of paper, and then let it rest again. And you want to roll this out just as thin as you can, about 1/8 of an inch. And then, to get it onto your pastry pin, you just roll it right up on the pin. And remember with this, if everything's cold, you're not going to have any trouble. Don't know that I have this as wide as a pin, but it doesn't make too much difference. You can take your hand and push it out. And then you want to cut some of the edges off, because that's where your folds were, and that the pastry isn't as even. It won't rise in as even layers. I'm just using one of these little pastry wheels that I got at the supermarket, and they're very convenient. That's just evened off all around. And then the whole thing with the Napoleon, you think it's funny to make puff pastry and then keep it down, but it's the puff pastry that has the tenderness to it. And to keep it again down while it's baking, you want to prick it all over at about 1/2 inch, or about 1/4 inch places, and you can use 2 forks like this. Or I found this wonderful instrument at our big department store, which looks like a steam roller. It's a heavy aluminum, and it has prickles on it. And when I looked at it, I said, gosh, I know that's going to be good for something. And it wasn't until I started making Napoleons that I found this was just the perfect thing. You see, I've pricked it all around. And then, again, to keep it down, you want to have another pastry sheet the same size, buttered on the back, and then just lay this right over it. And this is going to, again, keep it down. And you'll see when I'm assembling why you want to keep the pastry down as much as possible, because it just, into the oven, it just sort of starts puffing and puffing. You just want to keep pressing it down, because it's, the quality of that tenderness is lovely, whether it's pressed down or puffed up. And then this goes into a 450-degree oven. And if you were doing 2 of them, you'd put them in the top, upper and lower middles of the oven. And this is preheated 450-degree oven, and you leave it for about 5 minutes. And then you lift the pastry plaque up and then prick it again to keep it down. And you bake it for about 15 minutes in all, until it's a very light, lovely brown all over. It looks just like this. And this is very much of your eye as to how long to leave the pastry plaque on. I've found I leave it on for 5 minutes, I prick it, then I put the pastry plaque on again for another 4 or 5 minutes until it's just sort of firmed up. And then I take the plaque off and let it brown lightly, and then I put the plaque on again while the pastry's still soft so it won't curl up. Because if you take it out and cool it, you'll find that the edges begin to curl up, but if it's weighted down by the other pastry plaque, this will keep it nice and flat. And then after you have your big sheet done, the rest of making a Napoleon is simply an assembly job. You want to have apricot glaze. That's that dear old friend of the French pastry, and some kind of a white icing. This is a white fondant, and some melted chocolate. So when these are all ready, you're ready to assemble. Now you want to cut this sheet into 3 strips. They're about 4 inches wide, and I find these little pastry wheels just perfect. You find that it's only with puff pastry, or pâte feuilletée, that you can cut down like this without having the pastry split. I tried to use it with some leftover pastry, and it just all split. And then you have your apricot glaze, and this is our dear old friend of apricot jam pushed through a sieve and then boiled down with a bit of sugar until it's thick and sticky. I use 2 tablespoons of sugar for each cup of sieved apricot jam. And this apricot glaze is extremely nice on the Napoleons because it not only gives a little waterproofing so that your pastry cream filling doesn't sink into the pastry, but it also gives an added flavor. So this has on all 3 of these strips, the apricot glaze. And now you have your pastry cream. I guess I didn't show you that. This is crème pâtissière, which we have used before. And you'll find this in any good cookbook. It's just called pastry cream or crème pâtissière. And put on, a layer about 1/8 of an inch thick. You can use whipped cream, too. You know, if you went into a French pastry shop in France and asked for a Napoleon, they wouldn't know what you were talking about because they call these millefeuilles, or 1,000 leaves. And these are just mounted upon each other. There goes that upon there. And then the top one doesn't have any pastry cream on top of it. It has the fondant icing. And fondant icing, again, this can be any kind of white sugar frosting, but fondant is typical. Or you could even use just powdered sugar. This just gets poured all on. And if you look up in any cookbook for fondant icing, and you'll find the recipe. I didn't cut those quite as evenly as I should, but we'll finish that. We can decorate that with the chocolate. And now we have the chocolate on top. I don't know why these are in this country called Napoleons. If anybody knows, please tell me. I imagine, as in so many of the names, that it might very well have been invented by a French chef living in England and working at one of the great English houses. Now, this is melted chocolate, and we now have the final decoration. I'm putting the melted chocolate in just a paper cone, and then you get just a line of it that goes down. I found one of the best ways to melt chocolate is to put it in a very low oven at about 175 degrees. Ooh, that's the trouble with this. Let's get all over one. And now you have the final. Get some of this chocolate off me. The final fillip of taking your knife and pulling down this way. You see how it draws the chocolate along with it. And then you can pull the knife back the other way, which gives a slightly different effect. There. And now I'm going to wash my hands, or I've got this chocolate all over them. The beauty of the Napoleons is the freshness of the pastry. I have found that if you want to make your puff pastry ahead of time and bake it, the thing to do is to let it cool off and then freeze it. Because I've found, even though it's all made with butter and you can reheat it again to freshen it, it doesn't have that perfectly beautiful, fresh cooked taste unless it's either freshly, you really have to freshly cook it and then freeze it. And then to freshen it up again just before cooking, turn your oven on to 350 degrees and put the pastry in, turn the oven off and let it warm up just a little bit, and that will freshen it, and then let it cool and you're ready to mount your Napoleons. And another thing also is, I think that the Napoleons taste the best if they're also assembled freshly so that the cream doesn't sink down into the pastry. Ideally, after this design has been made, then it should be refrigerated for about an hour to give the pastry cream a chance to firm up a little bit. But I'm going to cut this anyway. And when you cut it, take a very sharp knife and you cut it with a sawing motion. I'm going to make a little mark. And these are cut in about 2-inch pieces. You see, I'm just sawing up and down. Had this fondant set, it would be slightly more easy to cut. But the beauty of the Napoleon is everything fresh and of the finest ingredients. And these are delicious for dessert or if you're having a tea party or a coffee party. It's marvelous. Now, I think it's the kind of dessert that people think that they can only find in restaurants and not find, and that you can't make at the home. When actually this whole Napoleon business is really a come-on, because I want to get you started on French puff pastry. Because it really is, it's the pastry of all of them, and once you've tasted, they know that lovely, tender, buttery quality. You'll just absolutely never forget it. And it just melts in your mouth, and there are dozens of things you can do with puff pastry. Napoleon is only one of them. So that's all for today on The French Chef. This is Julia Child. Bon appetit.
The French Chef has been made possible by a grant from the Polaroid Corporation and a grant from Hills Brothers Coffee Incorporated. Julia Child is co-author of the book Mastering the Art of French Cooking.